They called you crazy at first. They laughed. They dismissed you. They rolled their eyes. They acted like you were imagining things. They told you that you were overthinking. They told you that you were too emotional. They told you that you were too sensitive. They told you that you were reading too much into it. And after hearing those things long enough, you started asking yourself a dangerous question. What if they're right? That's what made it so painful. It wasn't just what they said. It was that they slowly taught you to question yourself, to question your intuition, to question your instincts, to question your memory, to question your judgment, to question your reality. And if you've ever experienced that, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because one of the most painful things a person can lose isn't a relationship. It isn't money. It isn't status. It's trust in themselves. Think about that. Once someone convinces you that your own mind can't be trusted, they don't have to control every decision you make anymore. You'll start controlling yourself for them. You'll second guess your own instincts. You'll ignore your own intuition. You'll silence your own voice. And that's exactly what happened to so many people. They weren't crazy. They were confused. And confusion is often manufactured by people who benefit from it. Because let's be honest, people don't usually call you crazy when you're agreeing with them. They don't usually call you crazy when you're easy to control. They don't usually call you crazy when you're accepting everything that they say. They start calling you crazy when you begin noticing things that they hoped you would never notice. When you start asking questions, when you start connecting the dots, when you start recognizing patterns, when you stop accepting excuses, when you stop ignoring your intuition, that's when the labels start. You're overreacting. You're imagining things. You're making a big deal out of nothing. You're always looking for problems. You're impossible to deal with. Does that sound familiar? Because the labels are powerful. If I can convince you that you're the problem, you'll stop looking at the real problem. And that's why so many people spend years trying to fix themselves, when the real issue was that they had been taught not to trust themselves. That's a heartbreaking place to live, because your intuition keeps whispering something isn't right, while your mind keeps responding, maybe I'm just crazy. No. Maybe you were seeing something that someone else desperately wanted you to ignore. That's a different conversation, because awareness makes people uncomfortable, especially people who benefit from your lack of awareness. I want you to remember that. The people who benefited from your confusion called your clarity crazy. Understand? The people who benefited from your confusion called your clarity crazy, because your clarity threatened their comfort. Your awareness threatened their control. Your boundaries threatened their access. Your questions threatened the story they were trying to protect. And instead of changing their behavior, they tried to change your perception. That's an important distinction. They couldn't always change the truth, so they tried to change how you experience the truth. That's why gaslighting is so destructive. It doesn't begin by convincing you that they're right. It begins by convincing you that you can't trust yourself. And once that happens, everything else becomes easier. You'll ignore red flags. You'll dismiss your intuition. You'll apologize for things that weren't your fault. You'll stay longer than you should. You'll keep giving chances that were never earned. And it's not because you're weak, because you've been trained to distrust the one person you should trust the most, yourself. There's a quote by Carl Jung that said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." I've always loved that idea, because eventually every person reaches a moment where they have to stop asking everyone else what is true and start listening to themselves again. That's where healing begins. Not when everyone finally believes you. Not when everyone apologizes. Not when everyone admits you were right. Healing begins the moment you believe yourself. That's the turning point. Because maybe they never apologized. Maybe they still think they were right. Maybe they'll never admit what they did. But your healing cannot depend on someone else's confession. It has to depend on your own clarity. And maybe that's why life allowed you to go through what you went through. Not because you deserved it, not because you were weak, but because somewhere along the way you were going to learn one of the greatest lessons of your life. That your intuition matters, that your inner voice matters, that your discernment matters, that your peace matters. Because once you've rebuilt trust in yourself, you become incredibly difficult to manipulate. People can lie, you observe. People can perform, you notice. People can tell stories, you watch their actions. People can try to guilt trip you, you recognize the pattern. That's growth. It's not becoming cynical, it's becoming discerning. And there's a huge difference. Discernment doesn't make your heart smaller, it makes your vision clearer. I truly believe one of the greatest tragedies is watching good people spend years believing they were broken, when in reality, they had simply been surrounded by people who benefited from them doubting themselves. That's why one of the biggest reasons I do what I do is because I help people reinterpret their past so that they can reclaim their future. Because maybe what happened to you wasn't proof that you were crazy. Maybe it was proof that your intuition had been trying to protect you all along. Maybe you weren't imagining things. Maybe you were noticing things before you had the confidence to trust what you noticed. And maybe that's why you're watching this today. Not to keep reliving the past, but to finally reinterpret it. To finally understand that the version of you who questioned yourself wasn't foolish. That version of you was learning to trust herself again, learning to trust himself again, learning that awareness is not weakness, it's a gift. And honestly, that's one of the reasons I wrote Phoenix from Stability to Power. Because power isn't becoming louder than everyone else. Power is becoming so grounded in your own truth that you no longer need someone else's permission to believe what you know. And maybe that's the part they never expected. They expected you to keep doubting yourself. They expected you to keep apologizing. They expected you to keep questioning your instincts. They expected you to keep asking them what reality was. They never expected you to trust yourself again. Because the moment you trusted yourself, their words lost power. Their labels lost power. Their manipulation tactics lost its power. And maybe the greatest plot twist wasn't proving them wrong. Maybe it was finally believing yourself. Because they called you crazy at first, what they never realized was that you weren't losing your mind. You were finally finding it. Peace, blessings, love, and power.